On Monday, ratings agency Standard & Poor's downgraded South Africa to sub-investment grade, affectionately known as junk status. Business reporter Mushfiqah Botha joins us in studio this afternoon to give us her expert view and tell us what this means for ordinary South Africans. Mushfiqah, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I say affectionately known because I'm trying to have a sense of humor about something which is not amusing and is deeply worrying. What were your initial thoughts when the news broke last night?
Initially, everything in terms of doom and gloom comes to mind, but that's me from my business perspective. I don't think, though, that ordinary South Africans have really grasped what a negative downgrade from S&P means. There is a huge misconception that a downgrade simply affects the wealthy, and that's just not true. That's just not true. South Africans across the board are going to be affected by this, and that's scary. We are already experiencing tough economic times. We are already sitting in a country that is in severe dire straits in terms of consumer debt, much less public debt, much less national debt. So I'm trying to find the silver lining. I'm really trying to find the silver lining. But I do think that one has to just put it out there that South Africans should really be bracing themselves for tough times ahead.
Now, Mushfiqah, not completely unexpected. You know, the writing had been on the wall. Had Jacob Zuma gone ahead with his cabinet reshuffle, I guess we didn't expect it to be as dramatic as it was. Is that a reason why Standard & Poor's brought the grading forward? Because it was only meant to take place in a couple of months' time, wasn't it?
Yes, but the cabinet reshuffle, the extent of the cabinet reshuffle has put policy continuity at risk. It really does create a sense of instability to the outside world, and that to me was to be expected. It was to be expected that a cabinet reshuffle of this magnitude, a cabinet reshuffle that saw key positions being wiped out, people in key positions being literally taken out, and then a reshuffle taking place that to many South Africans and to people, politicians and investors abroad just didn't seem to make sense. And that really increases people's sense of that South Africa is really unstable at this point in time.
Now, of course, that lowers investor confidence. It lowers public confidence and morale. I mean, let's talk more about how this affects your ordinary South Africans. I mean, I hate that expression, ordinary South Africans, because I like to think we're extraordinary. But just your day-to-day sort of basic needs, interests on bonds, etc. How will this affect your average South African?
Well, if you look at the fact that over 50% of the ordinary South Africans are 3 months or more in arrears with their debt repayments. That was before the downgrade. Ordinary South African citizens were already struggling with their debt. South African citizens already did not have enough money left to live on. Disposable income of South African citizens were being used up to 80% to service debt, where the international ratio is anywhere between 25 and 30%. So it is undisputed that we are a country in dire straits before the downgrade. What we now have to do is we have to say to ordinary South African citizens, how do you now settle your affairs? How do you now get your debt in as best order as you can to buffer whatever is going to come from the downgrade? Because it is highly unlikely that interest rates on debt will not increase. It is a probability that it will. And that is going to affect people who are paying debt. And not only who are paying debt, it's not only will they be able to service their debt, but will they have enough money left to live on? Will they then have enough money left for basics like electricity, food and transport? Income is definitely not going to increase to the extent that interest rates are going to increase. So income and expenditure ratio is not going to be really, really what the South African citizen needs right now. And I think we need to literally be in a space where we give South Africans as much information to better equip themselves with how to navigate these waters forward.
I mean, it still might seem like a very sort of abstract situation for many South Africans. How soon until they actually start to feel the pinch? And obviously we've got Moody's rating coming up soon. They sort of predicted that on Friday. Is that likely to come forward, and are they likely to follow suit?
One would think that Moody's is likely to follow suit, as much as we're hoping that they're not. The signs are there that Moody's is going to follow suit. But the scenario that I always think of is that, you know, we speak to South Africans in very jargonized, intimidating financial terms, and we speak of points and price index and percentages. Yet to the working South African, it comes down to rands and cents. And rands and cents today is what this downgrade means. If you take an average bond, if you take a bond of R1 million a month, and if you're paying at an interest rate of 10.5%, 10.5%, you're looking at about 9,985 Rand a month. If you increase that by 1% to 11.5%, it's an increase of 680 Rand a month. That's nearly 700 Rand. You're looking at 10,700 Rand. If you then add another 1% and we start paying at 12.5%, you're looking at an interest rate increase of merely 2% on your 10.5, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's an extra 1,400 Rand. And if we go to an extra 3% increase on a 1 million Rand bond over 20 years, you're looking at nearly 2,100 Rand. And 2,100 Rand for an ordinary family to find to secure the roof over their heads. That is the reality of the S&P downgrade. That is the reality of the junk status. And that is something that South African citizens are going to have to wrap their minds around. They're going to have to see the seriousness of it. They're going to have to know that they are going to have to seriously adjust their lifestyles, their standard of living, the manner in which they conduct themselves to accommodate and facilitate and best buffer this.
Now, we currently have a changing of the guard and treasury going on as we speak, and Minister Gigaba seemingly quite bullish, as are a lot of the new cabinet ministers, you know, and again punting, which is quite ironic, radical economic transformation. So at the start of his new tenure, he now has to deal with a credit rating downgrade. What do you see coming from, I guess, the rest of this this media briefing? And because another concerning point is that the nuclear deal is allegedly back on the table, and some of his other policies, do they concern you too?
I'm struggling to see how, if we could not afford the nuclear deal before the downgrade, how we would be able to afford it now that getting money is going to cost us so much more. So that's something that I'd like to see how that pans out. Something that Minister Gigaba has admitted is that it will impact private investment, but he's not too concerned about the external impact and the external issues. But unfortunately, that is not how you look at it when you're looking at a country who is affected by how the external and international world views it. It's fine if you're working within your household. Within your household, you can decide, I want to take this into account, and I won't take this external factor into account, and I'll take that factor. Unfortunately, as a country, you're not at luxury and at liberty to do that.
And just looking at the impact, again, sort of at the bigger picture, you know, you're going to have increases in unemployment. You know, they're predicting factory shutdowns. Government will have less to spend on social programs. You know, those kind of things, when you take that into account, it really is a dire situation, and not many countries do recover from a junk status, and it's at least a 5-year process if and when they do.
Before the downgrade to junk status, the South African economy had virtually ground to a halt in 2016 with a growth rate of only 0.3%. We only had a growth rate of 0.3%. That was before the downgrade. Before the downgrade, it was estimated that South Africa's economy needed a growth of at least 6%. At least 6% to significantly reduce unemployment, poverty, inequality. I'm very interested to see how that figure is going to now be shifted, and I'm very interested to see what plans are going to be put in place for us to reach the required growth figure. How are we going to achieve that? If we needed 6% before the downgrade, and we're then looking at needing more growth after the downgrade, how are we going to achieve that? One is looking forward to see what plans are going to be put in motion to get there, because it's also all good and well that we speak of this is what we need and this is the growth that we need, and how? Show us the plans. What are we going to do? What are we expected to do? What are you as government expected to do to reach that growth? And then again, what happens when we don't? What happens when we don't? We are already again sitting with, again, I have to mention it, that the consumer debt in the country is 1.4 trillion. We're sitting with 1.4 trillion rands with a consumer debt. Consumers in South Africa are overwhelmed by debt. There are many factors which are not linked to the downgrade, obviously, which contribute to consumer debt. But that's the reality of the situation. Again, South Africans are going to really need to tighten their belts and then equip themselves with the necessary information as to how to wade through all of this.
Mushfiqah, let's just go back a few days to last Friday when the cabinet reshuffle took place, obviously, namely Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan and his deputy, BC Jonas, losing their positions, and the hard work that Pravin Gordhan had put in to get the rand to its strongest position in 14 odd months, to then be completely wiped out. What were your feelings when that happened? I mean, as a business analyst, as a business person, I mean, how did you feel about just that absolute sort of sabotage of economic growth?
Well, I was hoping somebody was going to come at 12 on the Friday evening and say, April's Fool. I was really hoping I was really hoping, as much as you live in the real world, you were really hoping that it wasn't real. I was really hoping, because I instinctively knew that the rand was going to go into a free fall, which it has. I instinctively knew that everybody, just on a personal level, every friend that had made plans to travel, every friend and family member that had made plans to buy property, every person in everyday life would be negatively affected, because the rand in its free fall affects every aspect of our life. It does affect every aspect of our life. And so it was it a shock? No. We knew that when this took place, the rand was going to lose value, and lose great value. But was one still taken aback when it happened? Yes. But was it a surprise that it did happen? No, I don't. You would have to have been living under a rock not to know that the rand would lose great value when doing something like that.
And has it lost the amount of value that you suspected it would? I mean, what has happened in the markets today? How much worse can you see it getting?
I'm hoping that we're not going to be reaching 14 rand to the dollar. I'm really hoping that. I'm really hoping that somehow the other Minister Gigaba will stand tall and come up with responsible measures and responsible answers, and that Minister Gigaba also takes the time and the consideration in looking at things not from a macroeconomic perspective, but also looking at it again from the consumer's perspective and getting back out there and saying, you know what, hey, this is what is happening. We are in a bad space, and that's another thing we actually have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge that we are in a bad space by us saying that no, everything is fine, and then interest rates going up by 3% and a homeowner's bond repayment going up by over 2,000 Rand a month. It also doesn't work. There has to be an acknowledgement that we are in a crisis, we need to be doing something, and this is how we are going to fix the crisis. Because if you're also just going to stand back and say, okay, let's just see where this takes us, it could take us down to 15 Rand to the dollar, and I don't think anybody wants to see that.
Okay, Mushfiqah, thank you for your insight this morning. Mushfiqah is going to replace me in the hot seat later this afternoon with some more analysis on South Africa's recent credit downgrade. Stay with us.